All right, Jim, we're back.
It's good to be back, man. It's good to be back.
Yeah,
Exciting day for us here, I think.
I
Exciting
think
day.
so. Yeah, new stuff for me, especially. I starts new for me. So
Yeah, Sartre. I mean, Sartre. I've been looking at Sartre, for a lot of years, but it's been a long time since I really sat down and gave the devil his due, as it were.
yeah,
I wanted to have like a beret and a cigarette, you know, and maybe just drinking. Well, I am drinking some like thick as mud dark coffee.
nice,
I
nice.
wanted the cafe setting for this.
Or get the real thick bottle glasses that he
Yeah, the
wears.
model glasses. Yeah.
So what are you reading these days?
So I'm still working on C. Wright Mills, the Power Elite with my son, and I've started, but I've kind of put it back because I didn't want to poison the well too much for what we're doing here. I started on Adorno's critique of Heideggerian existentialism, which is just reading the prefatory material is pretty interesting stuff. And other than that, I've been really obsessing over getting my next book finished, and I'm making
Yeah.
really good progress on that. Very excited about that. So,
Nice,
how are you?
nice. Yeah, of course, this week I was mostly reading Being and Nothingness, prepping for this. But I picked up whenever I have problems sleeping, I tend to pick up novels again, and so I actually picked up a book I read probably 10 years ago. It's called Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, who pretty good sci-fi fantasy writer, and it's basically about this city that at one point this threat comes that at first turns men into gods, and then about 10 years later, it actually turns into like this cancer. So you end up with these people that had powers and basically were worshipped as deities that all of a sudden now they're just like disheveled and disgusting. And so this prince from another city ends up with the same disease, and he has to go in and kind of see what it's like. So it's a super interesting book for sci-fi folks. So
If only that's how Mill's book on the Power Elite ended. But
exactly,
it will not.
it is. I do think it is an interesting like moral critique of the quote unquote deities that we worship, for sure. What's really going on in those walls? I think Sanderson has a lot to say about that, actually.
That's
So
cool. That's cool. Excellent. Okay, so we're on to Sartre today.
here we go.
Okay. And I think we talked a little bit about this in the first episode in our existentialism series. But, like Heidegger, is maybe you could date existentialism back to Kierkegaard. I know like Walter Kaufmann dates it back to Shakespeare and even the Greek tragedies. And I think there's something to be said for all of that.
Sure.
Heidegger's our first existentialist phenomenologist, maybe would be a fair way to put it. The German version of it,
Yeah.
and I'm putting a capital G on that, right? And Sartre is part of the like one of these central figures in the movement of existential phenomenology in France, roughly contemporaneous with Heidegger, okay, or following directly from his work and some of the later work by Husserl. And the kind of the triumvirate of this is it's Merleau-Ponty, it's Simone de Beauvoir, and it's Sartre. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And don't get me going on Merleau-Ponty. He's kind of one of my guys. And so Sartre is, like we were talking about this before the show, is sort of the cliche existentialist guy that people think of. And we both agree that that cliche has not served Sartre well because he's undersold.
Uh-huh.
Like, he deserves better. He's been caricatured in really blatant ways, especially in the world that you and I operate in. So we want to kind of like make sure Sartre gets some credit here. About Sartre, he was a novelist also, right? Was also like very close to Camus, or like I think to have a relationship with Sartre was to have a tortured relationship. So I think he and Merleau-Ponty and Camus, had their fallings ins and outs, and
Sure.
of course Sartre's relationship with Simone de Beauvoir is infamously stormy. And so he writes some novels and some like minor philosophical treatises before the war. In the war, he initially serves, I believe, was in an infantry unit, just like Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty was actually combat injured, right? Sartre is captured eventually. I think there's debate about this. I think his story was that he escaped, and others have claimed no, they let him go because his eyesight was so bad that it doesn't pay for us to feed this guy for the rest of the war. He's really harmless. I don't know. I'm not sure of the history and all that, but I think it's funny. But then he was to some degree involved in the resistance during the war in France, and he writes Being a Nothingness. My understanding is mostly during the war. It's published, in the 40s, and then it takes the world by storm, and it's the French answer to Heidegger in many ways. And I think that's kind of how we're framing it. It's like most interesting to us in its polemical relationship to Heidegger. Okay.
Yep.
And today I think our plans, we're going to look at some big picture stuff in Sartre's existentialism that we can glean from the first part of the book. And then next time we're going to get into a little more detail in a less, I think, commonly discussed section that he wrote on death that will really, really conflict with Heidegger. So
yeah, it's funny in my experience. A lot of, I've read existentialism is a humanism a couple of times, and most of the time in certain circles, that's like the sole work that gets focused on. And so to actually dive into this work and really understand his major posit, what he's arguing for. It was just very eye-opening.
Yeah, I think the influence of existentialism as a humanism is one of the symptoms of the utter violence that having to teach general education classes has done to complex thinkers. Because, there's no way you're going to, in most undergraduate classes, plunk this 800-page tome down on someone's desk and even pretend that it's going to be read. Okay.
Right.
And so here you want to have an existentialism section in your general population ethics class. So what do? You take this 30 or 40-page lecture that Sartre gave called Existentialism and Humanism. You let that speak for existentialism, ignoring the fact that Sartre gave that lecture extemporaneously, no notes. He just did,
which is insane.
He just did that thing off the top of his head. The room was utterly packed. It was hot. All this stuff. I mean, it was standing room only because this was Sartre, speaking in the wake of what he had done in Being a Nothingness. My understanding is the crowd did a lot of damage to the room. Okay, and Sartre's buddy was on the hook for the bill. Okay, so it's France and post-war, little raucous crowd. They're drinking and doing existentialism, and so Sartre let the guy publish the lecture, a transcript of the lecture, to pay the bill. That is my story. And so now that's become like the piece to speak for existentialism in France, which is utterly unfair. It's utterly unfair. Yeah.
Yeah. I love when intellectuals get raucous. It's awesome.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think the post-war French hard left university crowd got pretty raucous. I think. I think these were people who were not afraid of a good time.
Yeah. Well, the time too that ideas mattered, right? And so if you disagreed with what he said, or even if you might agree, you're still gonna have we're still gonna flip some tables. This is gonna be because because ideas freaking matter, and so to not have the raucousness, it's well, are we missing something actually?
Yeah.
You can say what you want about French, craziness, but that's, to me, I'd rather it mean something.
And ideas really mattered in the wake of World War II.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the things that we should keep in mind here with Sartre when we think of what he's doing polemically is, and I think this is very much true of Merleau-Ponty and Camus to some extent, and to Simone de Beauvoir, is they are saying there is no getting off the hook for what happened in this war.
Absolutely,
it is on someone. People did this, and that's one thing we have to understand is the French version of existentialism is about responsibility. Right? It's a responsibility that follows from a radical freedom, but is about responsibility for yourself and what you've done and the world that you've implicitly created. I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Right. Heck, if you think, you're in the middle of that war, you're thinking the world's over. This is how the world ends, and then you realize there is something on the other end of that. How the hell do you move forward? That's what they're dealing with,
And you're not in the mood to let anybody off the hook.
No, Yeah.
Especially, let's say you're French and like you've got these Vichy elements hanging out now after the war. And yeah.
Yep.
So, and that's one of the things is for Sartre. Uh, Part of his polemical point is to say there are no excuses.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And we'll get on that today. So let's. I would like to backtrack to something in Heidegger that needs to be
Okay.
emphasized. I think to understand how he's contrasting himself from Heidegger and eventually Hegel and what we're going to discuss today. Okay. So we talked about Heidegger and the distinction between presence to hand and ready to hand, and we talked about authenticity, right? And ultimately, what brings something into presence or what brings my world and myself into authenticity is this encounter with nothing.
Uh-huh.
Okay, there's an encounter with nothing, and we talked a lot about Heidegger's kind of implicit atheism. Okay, because there's no getting to something outside of the meaning of being for Dasein. So we're always kind of enclosed on ourselves in a way. Okay, so there's no deity coming from without and making itself present to us in this world. For the Heidegger of being in time, later it might be different. Okay. But note this, and we have to remember too, is like a lot of people look at what's going on in being in time, and they read off of that something like mysticism. Okay,
Uh-huh.
and Heidegger had lectured on figures like Meister Eckhart and medieval mystics, and he was himself a medievalist. He wrote his dissertation, or one of them anyway, on Duns Scotus. Okay, and I think it's to note there is like in a lot of people look at Heidegger and say he's an atheist in the same sense that a Meister Eckhart might say he's an atheist, to say that the God is no thing,
Uh-huh.
and take that really 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 seriously. Okay, so when Heidegger, in an essay or a lecture he gave kind of in the period not long after being in time, called "What is Metaphysics," he kind of pulls these themes back up and talks about how what metaphysics is the holding of what is out over the nothing.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so like for Heidegger, nothing is important as a contrast to the world as a whole. Okay, and so note then he says, contrary to Hegel, nothing is nothing. It's not a determinate anything. We'll get into what that means, but like there's a complete absence that brings the world as a whole to the fore for us. Okay.
Yes.
But now think of it though, that presupposes something like a transcendent perspective.
Yes.
Okay. That I can take up, the metaphysician can take up this position to see things in their juxtaposition to the nothing, as he says, right? The nothings, he says all those sorts of things. Okay. So at that point, like we can see why someone might say, okay, yeah, you're completely apophatic here, Heidegger. Okay, you're not a traditional theist, but you are saying there is something like this contrast to the whole,
Uh-huh.
wherein the whole comes to the fore for us, and this seems like more like a mystical theism than it is a complete stark, like strict atheism. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Right. And there
It's coming to know the thing by its opposite, right? You're coming to know
yeah.
what being is by knowing what non-being is.
Yeah. Well, so that might even be too Hegelian for Heidegger.
Okay.
It's that being only comes to presence in the contrast with its complete absence.
Okay.
Okay. But note that sort of puts us on like the other side of it.
Yes.
You see me like we can view it from the side of the absence, right? And then because like what is for Heidegger, what does that? It's death. It's our encounter with death. But it's almost as if he's saying we can take up the perspective from the death side,
Uh-huh.
from the outside the world side, from the side of what anxiety indicates to us. Do you see that? So it's not, whereas like for Hegel, um, his great example from the phenomenology of spirit in the consciousness chapter is he says, well, there's no awareness of here without the determinate negation of it as there. Like
Yeah.
here only
Okay.
has meaning in as much as we are at the same time grasping and concretely indicating its contrary opposite of there, right?
Yeah.
Now only makes sense in light of then, right?
Yes.
And it can only be then. Okay, do you see that? So for Hegel, things are only to the degree in which they have a contrasting other. Okay.
Yeah. So
And
for
that,
Heidegger, the idea of opposite is incorrect. That's
yeah,
not the
exactly.
term.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think this is a mistake I've long made. Okay. Um, and so the thing then is like Heidegger's not saying everything is like defined by its opposite. What he's saying is we can only become aware of being when being as a whole is contrasted to its utter absence.
Yeah.
Okay. But then that presupposes a kind of overall perspective,
Yes.
right? Which sounds now mystical.
Yes.
Right. I don't think, I think it is mystical. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can't help but hear that and hear mystical. It just
Yeah.
sounds, even in the sense of just like a mystery, of
Yes.
something that can't be known.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's mystical, right?
And he'll say stuff like the nothings, right?
Yes, exactly.
And
That
we
term
have
alone
to,
sounds mystical to me.
yeah, we have to let the nothing do the nothing so that anything can come to the fore. Okay.
Yes.
And all that. Okay. And, and, Sartre, once again, is going to have this like frenemy status with this. Okay. He's going to agree with it to some degree, but I think we have to note that there is, to a lot of people's mind, a lingering transcendental a hyphen theism
Uh-huh.
in Heidegger, in the early Heidegger, and definitely in the later Heidegger, right?
Yeah.
And we talked about at one point how Heidegger says, well, are you an atheist, a theist, a polytheist? What are you? He's like, well, I will leave it to the gods to be counted, to count
Yes.
themselves. Yeah. All right. So I want to have that
As a background.
in
Yeah.
background. Anything you want to draw out before we jump in?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, we could just jump right into it, but I think that as I'm reading this, the difference between the kind of, I don't know if the right word is staunchness of Heidegger versus maybe the more playful, if that's the right word for Sartre, but even the way he writes is a little more maybe surprising along the way of the examples he uses, the way he kind of explains things. It's just such of course, French versus German, right? I mean, that's a big part of what we're talking about right now. So like with Heidegger, it's like bump, 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 bump. And with Sartre, it's kind of like more like I'm listening to like a cello play or something. Like it's just a very different style of how they write.
Yeah. No, it's like East Coast, West Coast rap, man.
Totally.
Yeah. I think of like reading Beat in Time as like listening to a funeral dirge. Okay.
Yeah.
And whereas like reading Being in Nothingness is like listening to Coltrane.
Yes.
Like this,
yes.
like this kind of improv. And I have that same sense with Merleau-Ponty too. It's like listening to like jazz improv. Yes. We're just kind of working our way through this phenomenological problem. Yeah.
Yes, which for me, just personally, is more of a fun ride. Like that. That's just kind of. It makes for a better read, to be honest. And that's just how it is.
Yeah, exactly. And so, another thing too. Remember, for Heidegger, then authenticity, okay, is when you encounter the nothing, which then gives you the space to see the contingency of your situation, and then return to it resolutely and to own it, even in light of its finitude. Right. So. For him, authenticity is always going to be to own what you were, right? but open to the new possibilities for it. But it's going to begin by owning your facticity. That's going to be important.
Very important. Absolutely.
Cool. Okay,
yeah, so we're going to jump into part one.
Yeah.
The problem of nothingness.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I think to kick this off, because there's a lot going on in this thing, right? Is for Heidegger, Descartes is just the culminating error in a history of errors. Okay, so when Descartes introduces the cogito as the point of departure for philosophical reflection, right, or the only grounding for philosophical reflection, Heidegger sees that as like, aha, I told you so. Okay, this is when Parmenides defined being in terms of thought, it was going to end very badly in Descartes at some point. Okay, and Being in Time is not a book about consciousness. And in fact, Sartre says something like that in the introduction. He's to Being in Nothingness. He says, Heidegger, refuses consciousness but then he says, but he has a problem ever getting it back. So I think what starts saying is Heidegger begins by resolutely, as it were, refusing the Cartesian move.
Uh-huh.
Okay, that he thinks that the cogito is a mistake, or it's something that only comes up in cases where there's been a breakdown. Okay,
Uh-huh.
and whereas Sartre is going to say no, there is always a pre-theoretical cogito. Okay,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
so anything that I encounter that I'm doing, okay, that sort of that comfortable being in the world that that Heidegger emphasizes in the early part of being in time, that we go around in the world mostly just kind of doing the thing, unreflecting, et cetera, et cetera. Sartre thinks there is always an implicit footnote on that, which says for consciousness, for
Yes.
consciousness, for
Yeah,
consciousness.
and yeah. In fact, in the first paragraph, and I'm reading. You're reading which translation?
I've got Richmond, and you've got
Okay.
Barnes. Does
Yep.
does Barnes give you the French pages too? Or
No.
in the margin? Fair enough.
Yeah. The first
Shoddy,
paragraph.
shoddy work.
I'm sorry. Yeah, shoddy work.
Shoddy
Yeah.
work. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
What you're saying?
So in the first paragraph, so I'm just going to read a couple of
Mm-hmm.
sentences here. It says Descartes found himself faced with an analogous problem when he had to deal with the relation between the soul and body. And I'm kind of jumping off of
Yeah.
what you said about what Heidegger is doing. He planned then to look for the solution on the level where the union of thinking for the solution on that level, or I'm sorry, he planned then to look for the solution on the level where the union of thinking substance and extended substance was actually affected, that is, in the imagination. His advice is valuable. To be sure, our concern is not that of Descartes, and we do not conceive of imagination as he did. But what we can retain is the reminder that it is not profitable first to separate the two terms of a relation in order to try to join them together again later. The relation is a synthesis. Consequently, the results of analysis cannot be covered over again by the moments of this synthesis. So
Right.
basically, you can't separate these things and then think that your conclusions now you can come back
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
and bring them back together.
The genie is out of the bottle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We have discovered consciousness, right? And what Sartre calls being for itself.
Uh-huh.
Like there's being fora, okay,
Uh-huh.
and then there's being in itself, okay, and that contrast is there now, and he agrees like to try to put it back together will be very difficult, right? And what we have to do is to go back and look at what is the original internal relation between these two things if we're ever going to have an account of things. You see that?
Yes.
But so note then, Being in Time is a book about consciousness.
Uh-huh.
Pardon me. Being in Nothingness is a
Yeah.
book about consciousness. It is about consciousness, and I think he's saying is that like Heidegger, one of Heidegger's failings is he's minimizing, or dare I say, repressing the discontent of subjectivity.
Uh-huh.
Right,
Uh-huh.
right. That he, as if we can just sort of tell a different story about things, wherein consciousness isn't really a player, and then get off the hook of it. Right.
Yes.
Descartes saying you can't do that, and Descartes does raise and create a terrible problem. He agrees, but the only way we're going to address it is to run it all the way back and
Yeah.
look now proceed phenomenologically and look for what is the interconnection between being in itself, the mere object, and being for itself, the subject, the
Yes.
consciousness. Yeah, yeah, right. And that attempt to work his way through a kind of like synthesis of the subject and the object is the theme of the book, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and he does so by starting to set up some of the potential. How do you have an object and a subject via certain examples,
yeah.
right? Like he sets these out as far as like negations and the like.
Yeah. And I think the most famous one in this first part of the book is his friend Pierre. Is it
Pierre is great. Yeah.
in the cafe, right?
Yep.
Which wasn't cliche when Sartre wrote it. Okay. All right. So so this is so what he does is he says, look, we take a case where you go to the cafe looking for your friend Pierre, okay, and he's not there yet. All right. And I think we have to understand, like, going back to the introduction, Sartre sort of thinks of the world without consciousness in it as a sort of Cartesian plenum. He calls it a
Uh-huh.
plenitude of being, right?
Uh-huh.
where things are just there in their complete fullness and thereby undifferentiated. Okay, so we
Yes.
think of the world, or at least the only our only way of conceiving of a world without consciousness would just be as kind of a monotone goo,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
And so you go into the cafe, and what makes the cafe not a monotone goo, okay? What allows anything to come out of the background and into the foreground is the fact that you're looking for Pierre, same, right? Looking for Pierre who's not there.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And this is important for Sartre. So what he's saying is the things come to the fore from the background. They become present, very Heideggerian in some ways here. They become present to us only because there's been an act of negation that's happened here.
Uh-huh.
Right. So if being is pure affirmation, anything can only come out from the background of being by an act of negation. Okay.
Yes.
So here you are, like you're brought to the cafe. You look because you're concerned to meet Pierre, but then it's everything's contrast with Pierre is what brings it out of being
Yes.
to you. Yeah.
Yeah. And he sets up two moments right before the story about Pierre where he talks about how it's expectation that often reveals or shows us what negation is, right? So
Right.
if I'm expecting 1,500 francs in my wallet and there's 1,300, well, now I've got a negation of 200,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? The expectation of that. And the same thing with something like destruction. He said, well, you would have to have already expected what was there to begin with.
Yeah.
So to see the Royal Palace in Amsterdam, you'd have to see it first. And then World War II happens, it gets destroyed. Now you know what the negation is.
He says this radical thing that nothing could be destroyed if there were not annihilating consciousness.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Because the thing couldn't come to the fore out of the plenum of being
Yes.
without a consciousness there to sort of cut it out, to carve it out, right?
Uh-huh.
To negate it, right? And so another example he uses later in the book is he says you've got a pen and an inkwell, okay? But Sartre says that's not in itself a pen and an inkwell. It is what it is in the plenum.
Uh-huh.
It is only a pen and an inkwell in relation to the value of consciousness, in its pursuits, in its interests, right? Okay. And so it could only be successful or fail, be destroyed, as it were, as a pen and an inkwell, in as much as consciousness has carved it out from the plenum in some way. But that carving out will never be just simply what it is.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, what I love about the example of the Pierre story in the cafe as well is we've all experienced where you go into an event or you go into a movie theater, for example, and you're looking for your wife. And all you can kind of hear is the background noise. You kind of see just kind of a blob of like faces that kind of color this thing, and you only experience the negation. You only see like, I don't see my wife. And then all of a sudden she raises her hand and you're like, oh, now everything else falls to the background.
Yeah.
And now the positive comes forward to me and I experience what I was looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important. So take a more radical example. Like you lost your little kid in the movie theater. Okay. And so now everything you see is really sharply present to you because it's not the kid you're looking for.
Yes.
Did you see that? Like, oh, every individual in there has come to the fore for you in a radical way because they're not the kid you want.
Yes.
Right. Like the noise of the theater is bothering you more. It's more present to you because you can't yell over it to get your kid to come. Like all these, you know what I mean? And so it's the contrasting work done by consciousness for Sartre that lets anything come out of the background.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And this is Sartre proceeding as the phenomenologist, right? Like I think
exactly.
in a way. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you can see now, I think, he's like, hey, I'm with you, Heidegger. I'm with you, Hegel, on the negative. I'm agreeing with you that beings come to being only through a kind of negativity. Okay? But now we've got these two different versions of it. You got the Hegelian version and the Heideggerian version of it. Okay, and then we're going to talk Sartre's version of it. All right. So I think he takes up Hegel first. Okay. And, it refers, however obliquely, to Hegel's logic, where Hegel says, look, being without its contrast to nothing is an utterly empty concept, and nothing without its contrast to being is an utterly empty concept. But if you take them both and you look at their actual contents, they're exactly the same in Hegel's view, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I just say pure being or I say pure nothing, there's no descriptive way to differentiate them. So Hegel says there has to be a third thing always. That's the concrete existent, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's formed by their mediation. But then there's this internal relation between being and nothingness through the thing. Okay.
Yes.
And for Hegel, though, there's no priority of being over nothing. They are determinately related.
Mm-hmm.
You see that. Okay. And Sartre will now reject Hegel on this by saying, no. Being has to come first. Something has to do it, right? Something has to do it to bring about the being, okay, to bring out the contrast. So he actually says there has to be a being that is in some sense prior to the nothing that then does the work of nothing.
Yes.
Right. Right.
Yes, because it's consciousness, right? So,
which is consciousness. Yeah.
yeah, and I think we'll jump into his specific example here in just a second. But I had to say this line because I read it and my mind just went.
Yeah.
So he's going through. He finishes the story about Pierre, and he says the necessary condition for our saying "not" is that non-being be a perpetual presence in us and outside of us. That this is what hit me. That nothingness haunt being.
Yes. Okay.
Right. That they aren't these opposites. They aren't these things that contradict. They're things that intertwine in a way.
Yeah.
Right.
And okay. And so far, so Hegelian there. Okay.
Yeah.
But now the point is, he wants to say, but there has to be a being.
Exactly. Being.
Whose being is to annihilate.
Yes.
To make nothing happen. Right. Like that's what human consciousness is for him. It's like, it's the being that makes nothing happen so that things can come to the fore.
Yes.
Right? Okay. And so the difference with Hegel is he's prioritizing a being above others.
Yes.
Right. But it's a weird being. It's a being that is haunted by nothing internally, because what it does is it annihilates. It draws things into a contrast. Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
And then his beef with Heidegger here is kind of what we talked about. He says, well, okay, Heidegger, you seem to get that like there has to be annihilation, okay, an annihilation that is not internally connected, right, with the nothing, or with the something. But for you, the annihilation is all external to the world. It's all on the outside. And he's like, well, yeah, but how do I get an inkwell then? Right? Okay, and I think there's just this kind of fundamental phenomenological difference between the two thinkers, and that Sartre thinks it's just obvious that there's the inkwell over there, and it's contrasted against a background, and that contrast is not a special case that comes in the case of failure. That contrast is what lets that thing be available at all.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Right. So then, where does that put us? For Sartre, is human consciousness is the being, right, whose essence is to not have an essence, right?
Yes.
It's the being whose essence is to annihilate. It's to make things be what they're not in order to like make them available to it, right?
Yes.
Right.
Which then leads us to the idea of whether, there was anything to, before being, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if I want to read this whole thing, but I force-started it. So
yeah, do it.
Okay. So if adopting for the moment the point of view of naive cosmogonies, we try to ask ourselves what was there before a world existed. And if we replied nothing, we would be forced to recognize that this before, like this nothing, is in effect retroactive. What we deny today, we who are established in being, is what there was of being before this being. Negation here springs from a consciousness which is turned back toward the beginning. If we remove from this original emptiness its characteristic of being empty of this world and of every whole taking from the form of a world, as well as its characteristic of before, which presupposes an after, then the very negation disappears, giving way to a total indetermination, which it would be impossible to conceive, even and especially as a nothingness. Thus, reversing the statement of Spinoza, we could say that every negation is a determination. This means that being is prior to nothingness and establishes the ground for it. By this, we must understand not only that being has a logical precedence over nothingness, but also that it is from being that nothingness derives concretely its efficacy. This is what we mean when we say that nothingness haunts being. That means that being has no need of nothingness in order to be conceived, and that we can examine the idea of it exhaustively without finding there the least trace of nothingness. But on the other hand, nothingness, which is not, can have only a borrowed existence, and it gets its being from being. Its nothingness of being is encountered only within the limits of being, and the total disappearance of being would not be the advent of a reign of non-being, but on the contrary, the concomitant disappearance of nothingness. Non-being exists only on the surface of being.
Yeah.
That's just like, gosh.
So if there's gonna be annihilation, someone's got to do it.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So it's sort of like an inverted first cause argument. Right?
Exactly. Yep.
Whereas a theist asks, why is there something rather than nothing? Sartre's saying, no, the important question is, why is there nothing instead of something?
Yep.
That requires an account, and it's got to get into the world. It can't just be a nothing from without, right? Because that doesn't do anything. It's got to be a nothing from in the world. So there's got to be some concrete being that's doing it.
Yes.
And that for Sartre is consciousness.
It just blew my mind because it just flips so much of what we ask about that question. Completely on its head.
100%. Yeah. Brilliant. Like whatever you want to make of it is absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
And then what does that tell us about this consciousness, right? In itself, right? It is nothing, right? In the sense of like there's no absolute determination of what it is. It's the thing that brings things into determinacy by its consciousness which annihilates them. So this is Sartre saying he thinks he's got this phenomenological ontological argument for a radical kind of human freedom.
Yes.
Right. Like what the conscious subject is for Sartre is the responsibility of the conscious subject, because the conscious subject is what brings things into the fore through its consciousness. Right.
Yes.
So what are you in and of yourself as a conscious subject? You're nothing. You're a thing that brings things into annihilation. Okay. So you're constantly making yourself what you are by drawing your own self into contrast. Right.
Which I think is a great segue into the idea of bad faith.
Which is the
right.
You have to talk about this. My original plan was we were just going to do the introduction, and then we can't. We have to talk about bad faith.
Yes. Yeah. So chapter 2 within part 1.
Yeah.
Let's
talk about the waiter in that cafe.
Oh yeah.
Let's talk about that waiter, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So here you are. You're waiting for Pierre, and I actually have a waiter at our favorite sushi restaurant in mind.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. So, God bless him. But okay. So you've got this waiter who you can see is just trying too hard to play the part of being a waiter. Okay. Like he's trying too hard to pull it off, right? That he wants to be a waiter, and in wanting to be a waiter, he's affecting the role in a way. Okay. But it's clear by his attempt to affect it, it's just demonstrating that he's not actually a waiter. That is just what he happens to be doing at the moment.
Yes.
Right? So Sartre says this person is a waiter in bad faith now.
Yes.
Right. He's pretending at it. He's inauthentic. He's insincere at it in the Richmond translation. Okay. He's insincere as a waiter, however hard he tries to be a waiter. Right. Right. And that's what it would be to be in bad faith. Right.
Yeah. It's play acting, or it's lying, and it's lying to yourself as well. Yeah. Right. Like you're telling yourself, I'm a great waiter, but all of your actions that then affect that are all showing me that you're not.
Yeah. You're putting on a dramatic
putting on a show
performance for the other, and more importantly for yourself to be something. Okay. And the thing for Sartre is this is now this is the human condition, is We want to be, we like envy the in itself. We envy the object out there in pure being that gets to be at rest. Okay. We envy it. Okay. And so what do? We try to turn ourselves into objects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm going to be a waiter. I'm going to be a professor. I'm going to be a husband. I'm going to be a socialist. I'm going to be a Catholic, whatever. Okay. And Sartre says, try as you might, you have an awareness of your standing as annihilating subject and a free subject, and thereby you admit you could fail to be that and still be you.
Yes.
Okay. And then at some point, if you try to identify yourself as such an object, you've fallen into bad faith. You're at some level pretending it.
Yes.
Right. Right. It's somewhere in here. I think it's in this section in the Richmond translation. I'd be interested to see how Barnes puts this, but Sartre says all belief is troubled belief.
Yeah.
Okay. Because as soon as I say, well, I believe that, you've taken critical distance, you've thereby annihilated it and yourself, and you're admitting you could be you without being it.
Yes.
Okay. So there's always a sneaking question, like, how committed am I to this belief? Okay.
Yes.
And so so with freedom, he says, comes this anguish. Okay. Because now, as a free being, you're admitting that your existence precedes your essence, and it's up to you to take up an essence. But then, if it was up to you to take up an essence, well, guess what? Like, you're never off the hook for it. You can never be done doing that. You're always going to be checking yourself. Yeah, but is that really what I'm about? Is that what I'm really about? Is that what I'm really about? Is that what I'm really about? And you're always going to have to like look at these possibilities for other ways of being. And for Sartre, that never gets settled.
Yes.
Right. Nor could it. Yeah.
Yes. And oftentimes too, the danger there is that you limit yourself. Your human freedom then is a limitation, right? Because let's say, I'm a mother and nothing more. So there's no other possibilities of you being able to do other things besides what a mother does,
Right.
And so therefore your freedom now is limited. And for him, that's part of what consciousness is. And so therefore you're doing a disservice to yourself, for sure. But I think that it's interesting because I think very practically about some of this part in particularly of how much play acting we all do. Because, gotcha. And like you said earlier, I mean, like you cannot escape bad faith. Like we're all going to do it in some, but to be aware of it is at least maybe a step.
So like right now, it really would be hard for me to seriously imagine my life at my current age without Jen, my wife, in it.
Yeah.
Okay. And yet I have to admit it didn't have to go this way.
Right.
Right. There were myriad decisions I made that have led to this. Right. Okay. There's myriad decisions that she made that led to this. So however difficult it would be for me to conceive it, I could be me without her.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Then this would Sartre would say, I'm not saying I in any way desire that or anything like that. Right. But I have to admit there are other possibilities, and I cannot say full stop what I am, period. Full stop is Jen's husband.
Yeah.
Right. I would like to be able to say that. That would be a relief, according to Sartre, right? But yet I can't. And that is a kind of objective standing no subject can have.
Yes.
Right.
Well, so a question then is commitments then, right? In Sartre, a commitment is not necessarily what I am. Right. It becomes part of maybe a role I play, or at least a commitment towards my wife, my kids, these kinds of things that I see for the rest of my life. But it's not necessarily a defining of my consciousness or of my being. Is that how he would say it?
And I think he would say, and that's why it's a commitment. Like, inkwells are not committed to anything. They just are what they are.
Yeah.
Right. Non-human animals are not committed to anything. They're just doing their thing. Okay. Yeah. It's only the human, because it can fail in a commitment, that it can have a commitment.
Yes.
Right. And for like there is no one who has a higher view of commitment than Sartre. Okay.
Yeah.
But his point is that commitment has to be made again and again and again and again,
Mm-hmm.
constantly. And to think that, oh no, it's a settled thing now for him is to fall into bad faith, right?
Yeah.
For Sartre, like what authenticity is, what sincerity is, what good faith is the admission that one is in constant threat of bad faith.
Yes.
It's to say what I am in myself is a thing that's nothing in itself.
Yes.
And thereby any attempt to define myself as a thing in itself for Sartre fails. And then it's going to require me every day to pull myself up and make my commitments.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and in your commitments, you also make a negation, right? Because by choosing one woman for the rest of my life, I'm also making a negation of all the other possibilities.
Yes, definitely.
Right.
But then that has to, but what does that do? Negations bring things into being. So all those possibilities are always there.
Yes.
They're always there, whether you like it or not. So sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which makes a radical responsibility for your choices.
100%. And that's the anguish thing is like, you are always on the hook. You're always on the hook. You're always on the hook. You're always on the hook. Right.
Yeah.
And he'll go really far with this. Like he'll say like he uses the example of, let's say I'm sick. Okay. He's like, yeah, okay. It's not up to you whether or not there's a virus in your intestines. Okay. However, he does think what the meaning of that is up to you. And what's done with that is up to you. And your attitude towards it is up to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And it's not this like internalized stoicism. Like he does not like stoicism, right? Because it's like you're on the hook for what you do with that with respect to other people.
Yes.
Right. Right. If I carry on like a baby every time I'm sick, that's on me.
Yeah.
Right. Something like that. Right.
Yeah. When part of his issue then with, let's say, of course, choosing to be a waiter is a pretty low commitment, but still a commitment.
Yeah.
But the role you're playing is to the being for, right? Like being with someone else. You're playing towards another, if that makes sense. So you're lying to yourself in your own head if you're making these certain commitments, and yet that's still not really who you are. But you're also acting for other people, right?
Yes.
He even brings up soldiers that are standing in line with their saluting, that they're playing for the other. And what he's basically saying is there's not really another out there that's like checking to see if you're making that commitment every day.
Yeah, there's no Lacanian big other.
Exactly.
As Lacan was, right? But
yeah,
and Lacan's relationship to Sartre is interesting too. Like Lacan seemed to like hate the guy in some ways, but also like drew some stuff.
really respect him but hate him.
Todd McGowan and Ryan Engley's episode on Sartre is really interesting. Anyway,
so to real quick,
just to point with that is like for Sartre though, the gaze of the other is always present for consciousness, even when the other's not there. Like we're always performing in a way for the other, and we're no more exposed than we realize we're being watched. But he does say, in as much as we're involved in linguistically embodied consciousness, we are performing for some other. Right? Yeah. And he would say, even like when you're by yourself, to say that somehow you're not affected by the potential gaze of the other, and thereby play acting at some level, right? Like I don't like maybe I don't say or do certain things, so I don't want to have to later look Jared in the eye about it, right? I'm still playing. I'm still in Jared's gaze there.
Yeah.
Right? And so yeah, let me just leave that at that. Go ahead.
Yeah. But basically I was going to say, just for your, to your point. So in my translation, it's page 101. Mm-hmm. And he talks, so in mine, he uses the term sincerity, sure. Yeah, maybe as opposed to like authenticity or something more along the lines of like sincerity is simply not lying to yourself. Yeah. You're actually, being true to yourself, if you will. But he says, if candor or sincerity is a universal value, it is evident that the maxim, one must be what one is, does not serve solely as a regulating principle for judgments and concepts by which I express what I am. It posits not merely an ideal of knowing, but an ideal of being. It proposes for us an absolute equivalence of being with itself as a prototype of being. In this sense, it is necessary that we make ourselves what we are. But what are we then if we have the constant obligation to make ourselves what we are? If our mode of being is having the obligation to be what we are.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting, like, so even that maxim, what one must be what one is. But if you're in the sense making yourself what that is, what does that necessarily even
What does
mean,
that even
right?
mean? Yeah. So think of the contrast with Heidegger on sincerity or authenticity here. It's like, so the
Yeah.
authentic individual realizes the contingency of their situation, realizes there's other possibilities, but then goes back and owns what they are.
Uh-huh.
Right. Like you go back to the village and you're like, let's make the village great
Yeah.
again, as it were. Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's other possibilities for it. Let's realize it. I'm going to go back and own what I am. Okay. Now, Sartre is saying exactly not that.
Yeah.
Okay. Because like that thing is up to you. Right. Now he doesn't deny facticity. He's like, I can't deny that I married Jennifer. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And I can't then just say, oh, I'm just going to reinvent myself as a non-husband to her and then thereby be off the hook
Yes.
of the consequences of doing that. Do you see what I mean? Um, I'm no, like I have to admit, like my past is real, my facticity is real, okay, and that was up to me, and then thereby I am responsible to it still, okay,
Uh-huh.
right? We've talked about the TV series, the Mind
Mind hunters.
Mindhunters, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting in that, spoiler alerts coming up here, okay, in that TV series, uh, the 20th century sociologist Irving Goffman is mentioned several times. Okay, and Irving Goffman, if you read his book Presentations of Self in Everyday Life, which I highly recommend, in the first chapter cites Sartre on bad faith. Okay, because Goffman's point is like from the sociological work he's doing, he's saying it seems like we spend most of our lives play acting.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and Goffman is seriously questioning whether there's any kind of inner core on sociological grounds, inner core abiding substantial self, right? That it seems like there's always masks being worn, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so in Mindhunter, Goffman is dropped several times. Okay, and at one point we encounter a woman who is sort of modeled as this sort of ideal of authenticity because she's like left her husband, left her child to go on her own journey of like emotional sexual self-exploration, is involved in kind of like non-standard relationships and things like that for the time and all that. And there's another very important character in the film who's sort of admiring her, looking up to her. Okay. And then in the end though, that is revealed as very empty.
Yes.
Okay. Because I think what it is, and I think a lot of people would say, oh, it's a critique of existentialism and Sartre and Goffman. No, it's not. It's an affirmation of what Sartre was saying, because to say that you're going to go on your own journey of self-invention, ignoring the commitments you've already made, Sartre would not have that.
Yep.
That would not have that at all, right?
Yep.
Because you have to admit what you have already done is something
Yes.
you've done and you've taken responsibility for it. You are responsible for how it goes forward, but you're still responsible for what has already happened.
Yes.
Did you see that? So I think a lot of people have misread Sartre and saying, "Oh no, you're just free to go out and do your own project of invention, whatever you've done in the past." That is not what he's saying at all. You are always in what he calls a situation, right?
Yes.
And that situation, his view, is your doing, so you are not off the hook for it.
Yes. Well, he says that like facticity and transcendence have to have a valid coordination.
Right. Exactly.
Right. They have to be capable of that. And then right after that, he talks about people who sometimes can deliberately arrest themselves in one period of their life, and those that forget who they were and kind of like reproaches or disassociates himself from his past.
Yeah.
And that neither of those are good routes.
Yeah.
Like you can't be stuck in a certain route of being, but you also cannot ignore the fact that you've made certain commitments and certain decisions along the way. Because, yeah, I mean, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you can say, "Oh, I thought I was in myself, an objective husband, but it turns out I'm this other thing now."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Right? That's what I really am. Well, Sartre would say, "No, you're not really anything. What you are is what you've committed to."
Yes.
Okay, right. And using another pop culture example, I recently watched the very good film A Complete Unknown about Bob Dylan. Interesting thing, like in the film, this isn't a spoiler, but it's Dylan is on this constant attempt at self-definition, and it doesn't land anywhere for him.
Yeah.
Okay. And it seems like it's mostly just having destructive consequences for everybody around him. Okay, so I came away from the film as thinking, is Dylan a hero or a villain here?
Oh.
Okay, because in the end, he seems to have just more or less wrecked the people around him to some degree, and in his attempts at self-definition without any real commitment ever coming up. Okay,
Mhm.
I think a lot of people want to read that as like, well, that's what you get with existentialism, and I think Sartre would say, no way in hell, right?
Yeah.
I think those commitments matter, and you can't just deny facticity. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. You would say that really what Dylan was doing was an act of bad faith,
act of bad faith.
right?
Yeah,
And it doesn't just affect him; it affects those around him.
right. Like even saying, oh, I was this and now I'm that, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's an act of bad faith because you're not any of those things, but you have done things that have consequences and you're responsible for them.
Yes. And it's really interesting because the modern American conception of the self, it's so much about reinvention and, changing who we are and constantly looking for, how to redefine myself. And I think that he would have a pretty serious problem with that. I think that he would say, well, you can't escape where you come from. You can't escape the culture you were raised in.
Because you did it.
Exactly. Even if you were thrown into something, there's still, that was you.
Yeah, because he thinks you have a vote in what it means.
Yes.
And you have a vote in how it's exemplified to other people. Okay. And I think you can see he really has in mind the Vichy thing here.
Yes. Yes.
Like you, right? Like you had a choice, and you're not getting out of that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I love the juxtaposition between him saying that there's a radical responsibility and a radical freedom to move forward, as opposed to in Heidegger to go back to what you are and own that. But instead, it's a consistent owning.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not to forget what you are, but rather it's a consistent owning of your commitments moving forward.
Exactly. Right. And also, I think you can see here, this is a much more radically atheist version of existentialism than you have in Heidegger, right? There is no perspective to take outside of consciousness. We are, as he says later in the book, we're abandoned. We are doomed to be free. There's no cavalry coming, right? There's nothing coming to help us. What we are, what we do is up to us, and thereby we have radical responsibility, right? Because we're locked in this cogito, this subject for Sartre.
Yeah.
Right. Humanity is on its own.
Yeah.
A complete unknown, as it were.
Exactly.
With no direction home.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. Which also gives, at least the beginnings of an ethical system of some kind, right? Yeah. Of that you treat us how you be treated, kind of a thing, maybe to at least start. But at least when you make commitments or you do certain things, own up to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think, you think when all of like Sartre's talk about anguish, it's the anguish that comes with realizing that you are absolutely on the hook for everything.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know that any thinker has ever had a higher moral bar than Sartre.
Yes.
Right. Like even Kant will say, yeah, you can be overcome by these pathologies of emotional life and stuff like that, and okay. Whereas Sartre's like, no, like your emotions are your doing.
Yes.
Like, at least the meaning of them are your doing. He always thinks there's this like footnote of for consciousness on everything, so you always could have done better.
Yes.
Right. Yep.
Well, I have to share this quote that I texted you this morning, actually. Yeah. So this is on 102 in my. So he goes through all of these.
Jared and I often will send sort of quote porn to each other. Like, look at this really beautiful thing I just read. You've got to see this, and like we'll get the scribbled underlined text sent back and forth in messages. So.
Exactly. Yeah, I sent you this one, and then followed it with the GIF of Ice Cube and Chris Tucker going, "Damn." So he goes through examples like the grocer. He goes through this examples of a tailor, an auctioneer, these people who are putting on play acting. And he says and this is just blew my mind. He says, there are indeed many precautions to imprison a man in what he is, as if we lived in perpetual fear that he might escape from it, that he might break away and suddenly elude his condition.
Yeah.
Gosh, like all of us, we don't want to be free, and we don't want other people to be free. Like
Right.
when I go to a restaurant, I want you to pretend to be a waiter.
I
When
want
I
you to
see
be a
soldiers, I
good
want you to be
inkwell,
doing
man.
soldierly
You be a
things.
good inkwell, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Which is where I think the kind of aura of everybody has to play act.
Yeah.
Like that's just kind of constant,
Yeah.
in most of society.
And and Sartre is not so naive as to think that we're ever going to get over play acting. We
Right.
have to. We have to have
Right.
everydayness, all that. But there's this temptation, similar to Heidegger, like to fall into it, to ignore the call of
Yes.
consciousness, and just sort of become the roles. But Sartre would say that fall is your fault because consciousness is always there, right? Because it's consciousness that does the annihilating work that lets anything come to the fore. So you are on the hook for the roles you play in the drama.
Yes. Yeah. And also I think that, and again, I think more even like kind of practically, as someone who experiences someone at a restaurant, I have a waiter. The waiter does something that doesn't necessarily waiters don't do. And I shouldn't freak out. I shouldn't think, well, I just experienced the negation of a waiter. What am I doing?
Yeah.
Instead, it's like, well, that's a free, conscious being putting on something that he's trying to do. And he made his decision that maybe didn't quite fit, because he even uses the idea of an auctioneer that's also a dreamer. It's like, we don't want our auctioneers to be dreamers,
No, we don't.
So it's like, well, even amongst ourselves, to experience those things together. I mean, to me, that just helps alleviate a lot of the pressure we put on each other to do these
Yeah.
kinds of things.
I've always found the restaurant situation to be this and I've waited tables too, but this horrible situation where we are paying to indulge some of the worst sadistic impulses of human objectification that we can have.
Absolutely.
Like we go into a restaurant and we're gonna like pay extra so people around us can pretend that we're kind of like nobility for this intelligence, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so we can pretend as if that person is somehow our social lesser, and that person has to pretend that I'm somehow his or her social better. And then when it doesn't work out that way, I get to feign an outrage
Mm-hmm.
and like get my death drive off on that, right? It's like I've always found this to be this sort of like just not like the great case of where we're indulging a kind of sadistic bad faith, right?
Yes.
Right. And we could multiply all sorts of examples, right?
I always feel that way when I go through an airport.
Yes.
I'm like, wait, so I'm already guilty of something, even though I paid to come through this situation?
Yeah. Exactly.
And you're going to rub your hands all over my body because something orange popped up on the screen over there?
Yeah, exactly. I
this
guess
is
I'm
weird.
just an object here, aren't I? Yeah. You've been objectified, right? So, mentioning the death drive though is, there's probably no more anti-psychoanalytic thinker than Sartre. Right? At least, I mean, like, yeah, he has a section called in the book existential psychoanalysis, right? But it's very different. Okay, and so maybe at some point we'll talk about this, but this is the thing is like for Sartre, like the unconscious is not a thing that can be used as like a bearer of responsibility for what we say or do. Right, yeah. We're always on the hook, and I have some problems with that. But I just want to bracket. I think we've got a broad plan here that's going to let us really address this in spade down the pipe. But I just wanted to put that. Yeah,
he gets into that in some of the first parts of Bad Faith. Yeah. He talks about Freud and the ego and the id as kind of an excuse to certain things. Yeah, which again, I'm with you. I would agree and disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are things that can come to us through ourselves that are not in our complete control, but at the same time, because the way he argues against it in the section we read is he says, well, I just deny that like the utter determinism that comes from the unconscious, and I think we're going to do an episode on this at some point. Like, people like Todd McGowan have recently argued that they think there is a kind of existential theory of freedom that you can find in psychoanalysis. So I just want to, as a footnote, put that out there. Like, I do. This is where I kind of come apart from Sartre and some things there. Yeah.
Nice. Any final thoughts, man?
Well, stay tuned because next time we're talking Sartre on death.
Yes.
Yes.
I do have to say, with the juxtaposition between Heidegger and Sartre, I mean, there's parts on both where I agree and disagree. But I do tend now to lean towards Sartre. I
I was
think
going to
that,
ask. Like, are you
yeah,
Sartre?
I think that part of it is because of the way he writes, but part of it is so much more, and maybe the idea of freedom being such a big part of this whole question. And I also just love the fact that he's very upfront about consciousness. I think that is huge, a
Yeah.
huge
Yeah.
upending of Heidegger in a way. So, but again, I like I'm Heidegger's a genius. So there's aspects of
Yeah.
it that are right.
Okay. So I guess I got to pin myself down here.
Yeah.
Um, I, I, I am very troubled by the notion of resoluteness in Heidegger. The idea that
Uh-huh.
you're going to just admit the contingency of what you supposedly are and then go back and own that unto death. Okay. That's a dangerous idea.
Yeah.
And I think once we understand that Sartre doesn't deny facticity, okay, and also that Sartre I think does rightly pin on Heidegger this sort of studied, you know, dodge of consciousness and the fact that the genie is out of the bottle after the modern revolutions, that indeed we are subjects and there's no going back, that there is that that Cartesian footnote and everything,
Uh-huh.
leads me now to, like, to really lean harder towards Sartre. And I think there were a lot of things in Heidegger that I was misreading, and I actually was like thinking about him more in Sartre's terms than his own. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, good episode.
Good episode, man.
Yeah.
At least for me. I don't. So,
Yeah, that was fun.
yeah.
A lot of fun. Yeah, all the viewers and listeners, you know what to do. Subscribe, like, share.
Commit to that like button, man.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
Like, hammer that thing like you're jockeying for tips in a French cafe.
Exactly. All right, man. Well, good
All right.
episode.
Yeah. Thank you, man.